Hi, good evening, and welcome to the virtual Connolly Branch of the Boston Public Library. My name is Emily Todd, and I'm one of the librarians at the Connolly Branch. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and before I introduce our guest speakers, I have a few brief announcements. First, I want to begin by acknowledging the Massachusetts tribe, the tribe of Indigenous peoples from whom the colony, province, and Commonwealth of Massachusetts have taken their name. I would like to pay my respect to the ancestral bloodline of the Massachusetts tribe and their descendants who still inhabit historical Massachusetts tribal territories to this day. I also want to thank our speakers, Kim Kelly and Nick Juravich, as well as Simon & Schuster and the UMASS Boston Labor Resource Center, all of whom have made tonight's program possible. Thanks also go out to our community partner, the Lucy Parsons Center, for helping to promote tonight's program. Following the main portion of our program, there will be an audience Q&A. If you have a question, please type it into the chat. And just so folks are aware, we are recording this program, and we will have a hard stop at 8:15. Copies of Kim's book are on sale at local independent bookstores, including JP Paper Cuts and our partner Trident Books. I'm going to drop a link in the chat for folks who would like to order a copy. And copies are also available to borrow through the Boston Public Library, though I do want to note there is a waiting list right now. So now I want to introduce our speakers. Our moderator tonight is Nick Juravich. Nick is an assistant professor of history and labor studies and the associate director of the Labor Resource Center at UMass Boston. He is currently completing a book on the lives and labor of paraprofessional educators from 1950 to 1980 and conducting interviews for the Boston Teachers Union Oral History Project. Nick is joined by our special guest this evening, Kim Kelly. Kim is an independent journalist, author, and organizer based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She has been a labor columnist for Teen Vogue since 2018, and her writing on labor, class politics, and culture has appeared in publications such as The New Republic, The Washington Post, New York Times, The Nation, and Esquire. She's also worked as a video correspondent for More Perfect Union, The Real News Network, and Meets TV. She's a member of the Industrial Workers of the World's Freelance Journalists Union and an elected councilperson for the Writers Guild of America. Welcome, Nick and Kim, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Emily. And so I'll kick us off just by saying, first off, thank you so much to Emily and all the unionized librarians of the Boston Public Library, who some of you may know in the course of the last year have had to be on the front lines of maintaining both public health and just basic decency in libraries. We appreciate your hard work in that respect. And also, thank you so much to you for hosting, labor history events. It's such a blast to be able to do this in this space, space where the public good is celebrated. So I wanted to start by saying it's such a joy to be here with Kim Kelly's Fight Like Hell. And I teach, there we are, pick up your copy, you'll get the link in the chat. So I teach labor history at UMass Boston. And one of the great joys of the last few years is having students come into my classes with some knowledge of the labor movement from Kim's columns in Teen Vogue, which have proven to be this phenomenal primer on the history of the labor movement. And at the same time, Kim Kelly has also been out there in the world doing incredible labor reporting, including out of Bessemer, Alabama on the Amazon Drive there, as well as I think probably one of the most important chroniclers of the Warrior Met strike, also in Alabama. And so this, there we are right behind you. And so this sort of tireless reporting has been incredible. We're so grateful, especially at a time when a lot of legacy publications have jettisoned their last labor reporters, and makes it all the more important. And so my first question, which is the general, how did you come to write this book question, also comes from how have these kind of different things that you're doing all at the same time come together? So you're on the ground doing this important reporting work. You're also thinking and writing about labor history. What sort of brought you around to saying, okay, I want to put this all together in a book like this?
It kind of snuck up on me because I think most writers, I've always wanted to write a book, but my idea of what that book would be has changed a lot over the years. Like I started working with my agent years ago when I was still working at Vice covering heavy metal. And my first thought was like, oh, gonna write a heavy metal book. And then as things shifted over the years, I was like, okay, then I put together a proposal for kind of a book of essays on basically, like I'm from a very like rural, like working class, middle of nowhere kind of place. And I've had kind of an interesting life. So I was like, oh, maybe I'll do a book of essays or something. And we shopped that around a little bit. And the publishers we talked to were like, that's kind of cool, but like, aren't you doing labor stuff? Like maybe you should do something about labor. And I was like, well, I certainly wouldn't mind. And I thought about it, and I thought about the kind of book I wanted to read and thought that I could write, and put together this proposal for what turned into Fight Like Hell. and we sent it out to some people, and some people got really excited about it. We're like, oh yeah, we're gonna let you do this. And I was like, oh, I guess I'm writing a book. And it was actually kind of hard to, because I've been a freelancer for, well, forever, but I've been full-time freelance since 2019 since I got laid off from Vice. Like, as is the way things go with digital media. And I've just kind of been hustling forever. And it was really hard to switch my brain off to be like, okay, we're just gonna keep pitching and reporting and writing and, you know, being a little chaos monster like usual, and let's focus on one big project. It took me a while to sit down and start this book because I couldn't switch it off. And I also was going back and forth to Alabama to report what was happening with Bessemer at first, and then later in Brookwood with the coal miners. So I actually had to get an extension to finish the book because it took me a little longer than it really should have to switch off my freelance brain and focus. But so I kind of always had Alabama on my mind because I was always going back and forth. Like, even like throughout the pandemic, throughout the past 2 years or whatever, I've really only been like here in this room and in Alabama. I mean, I hadn't even seen my parents until the book release. And yeah, so they're kind of always in the back of my mind. And I always found ways to weave in the stories of those folks. And Alabama popped up a lot in my research, and I don't know, for some reason Alabama's like one of the one of the major characters of the book, just because it kind of stole my heart and attention in a way I certainly wasn't anticipating.
Well, and I mean, for those who haven't read it yet, you open in Bessemer, and then I think you close in Brookwood, and so these run through the book as well. And one thing that to me was so inspiring reading this was, you know, in your Teen Vogue column, you've done a lot of explainers. You know, what is a strike? What is the NLRA? How do we understand these basics? I think of them as kind of labor standards. But what you do in this book, and you say right at the start, this is not going to be a book focused on the familiar characters of labor history. That instead you're going to focus on Black workers, immigrant workers, Indigenous workers, disabled workers. And so I've heard you talk about this before, but I'd love for our audience if you could say a little about how you kind of came to decide on that focus, and then how you went about researching their stories.
Yeah, that's the people I was most interested in reading about. Just as a labor nerd, I'm always interested in hearing about what was going on with the people that didn't get top billing or didn't get as many books written about them, or if there were books and papers written about them, they're kind of more in an academic context, maybe not as accessible to just, you know, your person on the street who is like a little interested but didn't know where to look. And honestly, kind of some of that comes from my heavy metal life, because I spent most of my life in the music industry until basically we unionized at Vice, and my attention went in a very different direction. But even when I was a metal writer, I tried to focus on women and queer folks, people of color, all the people that had made such incredibly important contributions to our scene and to our art form, but kind of got pushed aside because they didn't fit this, like, well, in metal, like the long-haired white guy with a guitar on stage trope. And the equivalent of that in labor is the white guy with a hard hat and a hammer. and I guess maybe it made sense in my head to kind of just take that approach to covering labor stories, because there's already so many great labor books. There's like a lot of them back there. And I know, like, I'm not a historian, I'm not an academic. I don't have as much of a depth of knowledge as some of the scholars and historians who have poured their lives into this work. But I'm good at finding interesting characters and ferreting out details and following breadcrumb trails. And that's kind of what I ended up doing with this book. I went into it knowing, like, okay, here's some people I know I want to write about, but how can I find different aspects of them? Like, for example, I write about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and that's like a big one, but I tried to focus a little bit more on Clara Lemlich's life and like who she was, not just this image of, you know, this fiery woman that stood up in a meeting and then led a strike and everything was cool. Like, no, she was an organizer. She was a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant. She got her ribs broken by the cops on a picket line. Like, I wanted to find the more human aspects of these big stories. And it was also important when I was sitting down doing my outline, I wanted to make sure that there was representation of lots of different groups of people in different areas. Like, there's a big chunk on Hawaii in the book, because like there's a really incredibly interesting labor history in Hawaii, but that you don't hear about it quite as much because it's a little further, whatever reason, right? Or like in Montana, or in like the copper mines in Arizona. Like, as I was going through my outlines and going through my research, I would think to myself, like, okay, there's a lot about this person or this place or this kind of people. Who am I not asking about? Who am I not looking for? And I would try to find a way to pull them in. And the research was very, I'm a little bit of a magpie, and I'm a journalist too. So my job is to go through every available piece of information and like kind of synthesize it and come up with a story to pull people in. So I read tons of books. I spent a lot of time at the Philadelphia Free Library once it opened. So some librarians there actually hooked me up a lot. Like I was there so much, they started trusting me with some of the rarer books and let me take them home, which is nerve-wracking. And like digging around on JSTOR and whatever like academic resources I could get to. I couldn't get to that many because I don't have that email address, but I have friends in academia who would like send me a PDF or send me a screenshot. So shout out to them. And old newspapers and magazines were one of my other big ones, because that's where you find so many cool quotes and so many colorful characters in a way that because it was like a contemporary reporting, like there's a little bit more hyperbolic, a little more colorful. That's how I found out a lot of information about Ida Mae Stoll, one of my favorites, the coal miner in Ohio in the 30s. And then on top of that, I did like original reporting and did a bunch of interviews with people. I kind of pulled together everything I could think of outside of physically going to anywhere because I couldn't.
Well, and for our audience, I will say, if what you're hearing Kim say sounds fantastic, this is how the book reads, which is to say vivid characters throughout history stitched together. I mean this, it has a kind of quality of almost radical genealogy that I found really just like sparkling and exciting.
Way to put it.
And I would say also that the sort of the point you make about writing characters and writing their lives fully. One of our partners tonight is the Lucy Parsons Center. You give Lucy Parsons an extended as a treatment that I learned from. And I wondered if maybe you could say a little about sort of researching her, thinking about her. She's such an important figure, but you really sort of get into the nitty gritty of her life throughout her long life. So
yeah,
tell us a little about her. Yeah.
Lucy Parsons, she's been a hero of mine since I found out who she was years ago. And she's such a fascinating character because they're like her own life is kind of disputed, right? Because there's a really great biography that came out in I think the 70s that got into her life. And that's where I got all the information that I thought I knew about her. And of course I have books of her writings and whatnot. But a few years ago, a scholar named Jacqueline Jones put out a new book that was exhaustively researched. I think it was Goddess of Anarchy, something like that. It's really good. It's really thick. Like she did the hell out of that research. And I learned so much from that book and it kind of shook a lot of my own conceptions of Lucy, because she was like one of my radical heroes, but she was also a person who was flawed and had kind of did some terrible things and thought some terrible things, like so many of our heroes, right? It added a dimension to her character that I really wanted to try and capture in this book. So I wanted to write about her. I wanted to make sure more people know about her, but I didn't want to let her off the hook, because I think if you love something, you love someone, you should be able to criticize them and help them get better. And if they're not around, to undertake any personal development anymore, to kind of just add to the understanding of the context of their life and their thoughts. And Lucy, I'm still going to get a tattoo over somewhere at some point. But I was glad that I had a little bit of space to get into the complicated things around her life. Like she was she wasn't who she said she was. She presented herself to the world as she said she was a Spanish and indigenous maiden from Texas, and she was actually born on a plantation. She was born enslaved in Virginia, and her family moved out west after emancipation. Throughout her long life of being this radical anarchist and then occasionally communist organizer, she didn't really spend much time on the problems and challenges of workers of color or Black workers. She was kind of a class reductionist. Like she was really interested in white factory workers. Like you can read more about it. You can read more about her, but she is just one of those historical figures that I was so excited to have a little space to get into. Like I wouldn't write a whole book about her because Jacqueline Jones did that, but I definitely had to put a big section on her in the book.
Absolutely. Well, and so some of these characters too, when I'm reading you writing about them, I'm thinking about the reporting you're doing. So this thing makes me think of the chapter you did on the miners, where of course you've been spending a lot of time talking with miners on strike who are connected themselves to these long legacies, not just of miners being on strike, but of whole communities, of women's auxiliaries. And so I'm curious, as you're sort of doing that reporting and thinking about writing about these characters in the past, and you don't have to just talk about that chapter, but so how does that kind of inform the way you think about these stories and the way that they might inform struggles, as you say in the book?
Yeah, it definitely it really shaped the whole way that I approached that whole chapter, because I knew going into it, I wanted to kind of challenge the idea of white guy in a hard hat, whatever. That's kind of a theme throughout the book, even though I was raised by those guys, love those guys, but they're part of the story, not the whole story. But I knew I wanted to mix it up a little bit. But it was really spending time down there and getting to know the women in the community and seeing the work they were doing that really kind of spurred me to dig as deep as I could to find more stories of other women in that context, whether it was enslaved Black women who were kind of forced into the mines earlier on, or women like Ida Mae Stull in the 30s, who was a white woman who decided she wanted to be in that mine, whether or not the federal mine inspectors agreed with her, or women in the 70s who post Title IX started working in the mines because they wanted to make some money. Like it wasn't a big, feminist statement. It just was the best gig going. And there's a section in that point in that chapter that it's so like it was spooky to me, like how much of a parallel I saw between the strike in 1983 in Arizona. Shout out to Barbara Kingsolver's Holding the Line. That was a really great resource for that chapter. But like there's a strike of predominantly like Mexican American and indigenous copper miners in 1983 in Arizona, the Clifton Morenci mines. They were steel workers, and they had a women's auxiliary. And at that point, the women who were involved, it was kind of a more traditional, more patriarchal kind of household structure. Like women didn't necessarily work outside the home or have much of a public presence. And when they started with the strike, the women would like make tortillas, they would make food, do strike kitchen stuff. And eventually, as the strike went on, they started showing up on the picket lines. They started getting into fights with the cops. Later on, they started doing these speaking tours and taking their struggle around the country to talk to people. And some of the women became so militant and so like radicalized in the best possible ways. And that's almost, not exactly, but very similar to what has happened in Brooklyn in Alabama. It's just a different, instead of like that specific community in Alabama, it's Black and white miners. And the women's auxiliary is still, in the beginning, a lot of the women worked, they're stay-at-home parents. They didn't work outside the home because their husbands and partners brought in enough money so they didn't have to. And the strike, they got a pay cut, went on strike, all these things happened. Now these women who have since started businesses and gotten jobs and turned into, true blue union activists have been traveling around the country too and spreading their message. Some of them that I've met, and one of the most interesting parts of it is seeing the way that the strike has changed people's entire perspectives of themselves and their political positioning. Like there are people I met a year and 40 days ago who described themselves as like, I'm a conservative Christian Republican, voted for Trump, all of this. I'm like, oh, all right. And now some of those people are straight up socialists. Like they've seen who showed up, they've seen what solidarity means, and they've seen who actually cares about workers and who doesn't. And I mean, there's a woman, Hayden Wright, who's incredible. She's running for local office as a Democrat now and like speaking at labor notes about anti-capitalism. Like it is so cool. And just seeing these two groups like 30, 40 years apart going through this same trajectory and knowing that it happened before too. Like Mob Lizard was no Shrinking Violet. Like the Mine Wars was not a one gender fight. Like I just love finding those connections and seeing the ways that history rhymes. It's really satisfying.
I thought of that chapter in particular, knowing the work you've done. And I will say also, as kind of a connection to our Labor Resource Center, we were founded by a guy named Jim Green to many people. And in addition to being someone who is really focused on the history of Massachusetts, he also wrote a few books about the mine wars, about West Virginia. And he's one of these folks who had a kind of long running connection. And so for me reading that and thinking about how we teach this history, we think about our kind of own legacy at UMass Boston. It was like, oh yeah, this is part of that.
Oh, that's so cool. And that's why I didn't write very much about the Mine Wars or Blair Mountain, because there's so many dope books about those things. I feel like most people with a passing interest in labor know a little bit about that. So it's like, okay, so I'm going to write about all this other stuff. Like, of course, shout out to Mother Jones in the chapter a little bit, but I wanted to, because there are so many great labor historians and writers who have tread these paths before and done great books about it. I didn't want to try to rehash anything. I wanted to try and bring things together in a new way, because that's how you get people interested, right? Like showing that, okay, like what I thought about this profession or this industry might not be how it actually was. Like, that's interesting. Maybe I'll read more about it. Then they'll read everybody else's books and everybody wins.
Well, it's funny. I said I wasn't going to do slides, but I will hold up the table of contents. I guess is the advanced readers version, so no numbers. But for those you can see, so these chapters are thematic and they take us through whole industries. And so I wanted to ask you a little about how you came to use that model for that. But I also wanted to point out one of the things that to me makes this book different. So these last three, the disabled workers, the sex workers, the prisoners, and just even having those there on equal footing to the harvesters, the metal workers, the miners, I think is a statement about the centrality of this work to labor history. But also, this is work where you're doing a ton of interviews, and it's powerful stuff. So I wondered if you could speak a little about those three in particular.
Those three there, I mean, I love all my chapters, but those three were the ones that I was the most kind of like excited about, because those are the ones I knew the least about. Because I knew about these topics on their own, but I had not necessarily explored the intersections that they had with the labor movement, because that's not something that has been immediately made available. Like that connection is not necessarily super apparent when you're reading about like whether it's sex work or disabled workers or incarcerated workers. Like in my head, I was like, oh, this is labor history. But sometimes certain like movements will get silenced, like, oh well, that's disability rights, that's a disability history, like that's prison history, like that's just a sex work thing, like, but no, they're all connected. And like I got to find really interesting ways that they were very obviously and materially connected, whether it was, you know, dancers at the Lusty Lady in the 90s in San Francisco unionizing and negotiating a contract and like going through all the same boring like day-to-day union stuff that any other union has to deal with, or finding out, actually shout out to Victoria Law, this great author and journalist, because I was interviewing her for the prisoners chapter about something else, and she mentioned at one point, oh yeah, there's this Supreme Court decision from like 1977 that there was something to do with unionizing in prisons. I'm not sure what it is, you should look it up. I was like, oh, and I looked it up and was like, oh wow, this whole huge thing. Like I won't spoil it, but I basically like I found out, and there are a couple really good books about it. They're a little harder to find. Dan Berger's done some great work on that, but just about like during the 70s when the Black Power movement, the Brown Power movement, feminist movement, the prisoners' rights movement, all of these movements were kind of, you know, coalescing around one another. There was a movement of unionizing within prisons. Like that was backed by some parts of the labor movement. That was like, you know, like I think it was maybe the Connecticut AFL-CIO or the Carolina. There was some like institutional crossover in a way that we haven't seen since. And that's because the Supreme Court decision, 1977, Jones versus North Carolina Prisoners Labor Union, cut that movement off at the knees. So like, even when some people have tried to organize and do things the right way, they haven't been allowed to because of who they are or where they work or where they're being forced to live. And it was just really important for me to pull in those chapters and show that these workers have always been part of this. Like it's not as some separate alternate history. Like disabled workers have always been a part of the movement, whether we showed up that way, like me, or we left the job that way, right? Because workplace injuries, workplace conditions, like that'll follow you home. And the disabled workers chapter is really personal to me, not just as like a disabled person, but just as someone who, yeah, it felt like as much as I want this book to make people feel like they belong and show them that like this history is yours too, that one for me, I was like, oh wow, so my people have done some really cool things that I had never even heard about. Because when it comes to disabled workers, there's kind of these two major tensions. The first one being that, of course, once you get into the workplace, you have to deal with all the same like conditions and benefit issues and pay issues, all the stuff that any other type of work has to deal with. But for disabled workers, for a really long time, we weren't even allowed to work. We weren't even allowed to have jobs. Like that chapter kind of opens talking about the sideshow, because for a long time in this country, like people like specific disabilities that were more like visible or upsetting to people for whatever dumb reason, like you couldn't just walk into a shop and get a job. You would either have to stay home with your family, if you're lucky, shunted off to an asylum, or maybe if you were kind of lucky and wanted to try it, you work in a sideshow. That's all we had. And it's not like that anymore, but it took a lot of work to get there. And it was fun for me as like, also like I've performed at Coney Island and whatnot. I can hammer nails into my face, like to pull in my personal interests and history in that way was really satisfying too, because I think it's a little unexpected, right?
Well, I thought I do love how you write in that chapter really thoughtfully about sort of agency within a wider matrix of oppression and discrimination. You're very clear that there's sort of a space here that people did and do make their own, but without sort of, saying, oh, this is some kind of liberatory thing. Like we're still understanding
the devil's bargain, really. Like some people, even just in the sideshow, like some people, like General Tom Thumb and his wife Lavinia Warren, who are from New England, I think maybe Connecticut, they made millions and they traveled the world and they met Queen Victoria. They were absolute. They met. I think they got married at the White House. Like they're as famous as you could be as a little person in like the 19th century in America, and they had a great time. But conversely, people like Julia Pastrana, who was an indigenous woman born in Mexico, who had a condition where her face was covered in hair and she had some like jaw abnormalities. She was billed as the ape-faced woman or the dog-faced woman, and she was exhibited around the world. And she was an accomplished dancer and a polyglot, and she was just a wonderful, intelligent person who was displayed as this kind of monster. And after she died, she wasn't given a proper burial. She was, I think the word is taxidermied, and her body was displayed around the country and the world for like decades afterwards. They found her in like a storage closet in Norway. And it took until I think the early 2000s for her to be repatriated and buried properly. It just goes to show, like, she traveled the world, she made some money, she didn't have to worry about, finding her next meal, but she wasn't even treated like a person. So is that a choice? She signed up for that job, but did she realize that it was going to end up with her mummified in Norway? I don't think so. So it's questions like that are interesting to dig into.
Yeah, no, and it's one of the, I think the real, I'm singing the praises of this book. I'll say again, everyone go
it's
out.
Really nice. I
think the connections between the sort of, the history we know and the history we don't. I mean, that's the power of a synthetic book, to sort of link these things in this way. And that's, even the way you talked through that example, I think demonstrates that. You also mentioned
super connected. There's so many different ways things connect. And if you read a billion books the way I do, like little things will jump out, and then you can try and find ways to tie them. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's always so satisfying when something like ping, 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 like worked.
And I will say, you mentioned New England, and there is, of course, there's some local content for us in New England in this book for sure, including starting out with the mill girls, as they were called, the mill working women of Lowell. And that's a history we know, but I'm curious, going back to that, it's a classic origin moment for like a labor history lecture. I'm curious, what did you think of coming back to Lowell? This is one that I think a lot of New Englanders have encountered, even like on a class field trip, and yet it's fitting it into a wider history is an interesting thing to do.
Yeah, even going into it, I was like, okay, everybody knows about Lowell. Everyone knows about the mill girls. Not everyone knows about the mill girls, right? But that's kind of another basic building block that if you know anything about labor history, you probably know a little bit about it. So I wanted to try and find some people that were doing cool things, because like you hear about the girls, but what about the individual women that were actually making this stuff happen? And really reading about and finding more about Sarah Bagley was kind of my my eureka moment, because she was so cool. She was she was a weaver, she was a worker, and she was really interesting because when she started out working in the mills, like so many other young women at that time, and most of those women were younger, like farmers' daughters from around the corner, but women who had like predominantly young white Yankee women who were getting their first job and striking out in the world on their own for the first time and trying out this whole wage labor thing and of getting a little taste of this whole freedom thing. And talk about a devil's bargain there. But this was a workforce that the mill barons saw as easily exploitable and easily kind of expendable. They assumed that the women, the girls, would go and get married after a year or two, so they didn't really need to treat them like real workers. And so they didn't. Much like garment workers today in Los Angeles have to deal with, they're shut up in with no ventilation and dusty fabric filled air in areas. It wasn't a safe place, and they were working 12, 14, 16-hour days. Their major demand, that Sarah Bagley was a big linchpin of her activism, because she started out in the mills and then she built a whole kind of political and labor career. Their biggest demand was basically getting a 10-hour workday. So that shows you how bad it was at that point. Getting a 10-hour workday was seen as this pie in the sky, radical, can you believe these broads kind of thing. And she was really interesting too, because you could sort of see the way that her mindset changed. When she started out, she was kind of like a happy company girl. She wrote cheerful little essays for the factory magazine, and she was like a team player. But the longer she worked there, the more she realized, oh, this is this sucks. This is awful. Like they're making so much money. They're treating us like garbage. Like this isn't what I signed up for. And she became involved in, let's see, I have it written down. In 1844, the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association was founded, and she became super involved in that. Really, she like they led strikes, they led walkouts. They really laid a lot of the groundwork for later activism and labor activism. And I think they also shook up this idea of, you know, women at work, which but for so many of the rich men that ran things was like almost a novelty. Like, oh, we have to keep an eye on them. We'll keep them in a bunkhouse. We'll pay them a little bit of pin money, and their fathers will marry them off. We'll have to worry about it. And these women were like, oh no, like we're workers. We're making all your money. You need to do something about this and treat us better. And that's kind of been a through line, especially when it comes to women workers for centuries in this country. And that's something I get into, like that's it's not necessarily New Englandy, but it just makes me think about the later chapter about the cleaners, about domestic work and cleaning work and janitorial work, and the idea of women's work and what women are kind of expected to put up with because, oh, well, that's just what you do. Like that's just girls, that's women's work. That's a pink collar job. That's whatever we can think of as a way to take power away from your labor. But really, like really New England was kind of ground zero for the genesis of that idea that like, oh, women are workers and they actually might have a little bit of leverage.
And I think in that cleaners chapter, you do bring around to the 2018 Marriott strike, which of course Boston was one of the launching cities for that. So I bring us back to the present. I think there's definitely a way in which that strike embodies some of that. No, in fact, we are workers. We have rights. We have rights as women and need to be protected from sexual harassment.
Right. Like the idea, oh, it's just a housekeeper. Like there's so many different ways that women's labor is minimized just by even the language that's used. And it's been such a through line for so long. It's like, how are people still dealing with the same shit from 1824 in 2018? Like there's been a lot of progress made, but we still have a lot farther to go. Like if we're still fighting these same battles, it's you always have hope. But see, things like that, there were some parts of writing the book where I was like, oh man, this is a little depressing.
Well, and this does make me want to ask you a question about the present, because of course we're in the midst of a really fascinating and sort of incredibly sort of bifurcated moment where we've got, on the one hand, we've got the Supreme Court leaking decisions about the end of Roe. We've also got some incredible organizing happening at Amazon, at Starbucks. I don't mean to link all of these things into one, but as someone who's reporting on the present, who's just written about the past, I'm curious if there are connections that are leaping out to you, kind of like the one you just made.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's class war. It's class warfare. Like that's the thing. Like whether you're trying to control and wrest away workers' bodily autonomy and the choices they make for living their lives, or you're locking them up in a factory and surveilling them and paying them just enough to make them think that this is a decent deal, like it's all kind of part of the same poisonous like socio-political morass that we're stuck in. I mean, it's all capitalism, right, at the end of the day. But and it's interesting because I've seen a lot of chatter about the idea of, well, what if we did a general strike for abortion rights? And I think that is interesting because I know there's so much conventional wisdom and very reasoned wisdom about like why you can't just call a general strike. We can't spontaneously do that the way we used to back in the day. And of course, there's lots of organizing back in the day too. That's what's kind of easy to forget on Twitter. But we are in this moment where people are thinking like, okay, mass action in a way that we've been doing it already, like just going out for a big protest for a day, like maybe that hasn't gotten us where we need to be. So maybe there's other tactics we can use. I mean, it's a little bit of a pipe dream for me, but I'm like, what if all the transport workers unions decided, okay, well, we're not going to work until you Congress people figure this out? That's all it would take. You just need the railroads, the docks, and the skies. I know that the AFA would be down, but there is so much untapped power in this country, and it's all, so much of it is held within labor, within the workers. The movement itself, like the leadership, I think if you know, in this magical world, we got to a point where a big general strike or just like a screw Taft-Hartley kind of wave of sympathy strikes happen, it wouldn't be coming from the leadership because they know about the laws, they know about all the legal mumbo jumbo that tells us we can't do cool stuff like that. But the rank and file and the workers, like there's so many more of us than there are of anybody else. And if people really wanted to cause some trouble, we could. We've done it before. Shout out to Lucy Parsons, 1886 with May Day. Like, this is me being a little bit of a, pie in the sky radical too, thinking, yeah, let's just general strike and not think about all the childcare and food and all the things that need to come with planning an actual sustainable strike like they're doing in Brookwood. But it is interesting and kind of exciting seeing that people are connecting these dots and thinking of how these horrible federal, like, evil rich people in suits and gowns are trying to control our lives. It's like, so it's not enough to control us when we get to work, you want to control everything else too. Like, that doesn't seem fair. And I don't know, maybe a lot of this renewed interest and optimism, enthusiasm we're seeing around the movement, thanks to recent successful efforts at Staten Island and Amazon and with Starbucks, these very visible, very public campaigns that I think have resonated in a way, because everybody knows about Amazon, everyone knows about Starbucks. They know they are big corporations, they know they make a lot of money and they're run by rich people. And seeing workers stand up against them anyway and actually win, I think that there's something there. I think that's going to have an impact. And if we couple that with the fact that we have an NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, that it seems like it actually kind of wants to do some stuff, like, we live in interesting times. And for once, that doesn't feel like a terrible thing, I guess I'll say.
Well, thank you so much. I am full of more questions, but I also know we've got an audience full of questions. So I want to open up the Q&A now and let folks drop your questions in, and I'll keep a look at this open Q&A, and we'll pass them along to Kim. And maybe while I've opened it, I'll take people a minute to type. I was curious. So I think it's 2 weeks and a day since the book officially launched, or officially published. So I was curious if there are any responses, any feedback, if anything, in the course of, I know you've been on the road a lot, or virtually on the road, as it were.
A little half and half.
Right. Sort of, if there were any reactions or things that just in the last couple of weeks that you've been thinking about as this has kind of come and lived in the world as a book.
It's been really nice. The people that I was hoping it would reach, it seems like it's reaching. Like, when I sat down to write this, I wanted to write something. Well, I wanted to write something that people could fit in their pocket on the way to a protest or a picket line. And like 300 some pages later, it's more of a backpack situation. So maybe take a little bit more effort. But I wanted to write something that people could read on their break or read on the bus, like read when they got home from work and had a little bit of time. That's why so many of the sections are so short. It's kind of like a bite-sized thing. I didn't want someone to look at this and be like, oh man, I got to sit down and read a textbook. That's no fun. No one has time for that. But I've gotten some really nice reviews and had some really nice interviews. Like, people, it seems like people have understood what I was trying to do, which is the most validating thing. And there's one kid, I shouldn't call him a kid, he's 20, young man. It's one young man I know in Alabama, in Birmingham, Isaiah Thomas. He's a super devoted worker organizer of the Amazon Union, the attempted Amazon Union down there. And last time I was down there a couple weeks ago, we got lunch and I gave him an early copy. And he was like, oh, I'm gonna get back to you with a book report. And like a week or so ago, he like tweeted at me just saying that this is gonna inspire me in my fight going forward. Because he's someone that not only has been part of that union drive, he's shifting his whole academic focus. He's gonna be a labor lawyer now. And that is just the coolest thing in the world. Like, the thought, and that's not because of anything I did, that's because of who he is and what he experienced. But even just hearing him say like that my book is going to be helpful and useful to him on that journey, that is the best compliment I could ever get. And people have been nice to me on Goodreads too, which I heard is kind of rare. So thank you for that. I know that's a tricky platform.
I'm glad to hear it. Well, so we've got the Q&A is open. I don't have any questions yet that I can see. Maybe I'm not looking in the right place. I'm going to click through here.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, and also we could always keep chatting.
We sure can.
Oh, someone asked via registration. How do you think the notion that working class white people vote conservative/xenophobic got started and hangs on? Oh, that's an interesting one. Well, I mean, a bunch of them have been. I mean, this is the thing, and I'll keep it within the context of the labor movement, because that's more. I'm not a sociologist, and I don't want to swerve out of my lane too much. But I can say in the history of the labor movement in this country, there has been like a very deep current of xenophobia and racism and every other ism and kind of type of bigotry you can think of, because it's made up of people. And in the earlier days of like organized labor, when it was just getting off the ground, those organizations were only open to white men. And those leaders were white men. And they had, I mean, not always the most progressive group of people throughout history, though that you can say that of any group, right? But I'll just say that earlier on in the labor movement, there were leaders, like very influential leaders, like Samuel Gompers, for example, who was actively xenophobic and racist. When he was the head of the AFL, American Federation of Labor, they were like super big fans of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1881. They were later on, like the World War II era, when the Bracero program kicked off and Mexican workers were coming across the border to work in agricultural fields. There was a lot of pushback from unions then because they didn't like the idea of people coming to take their jobs. This idea of people taking our jobs is very deeply rooted in this country. And it's such a harmful, like it's so harmful, like fucked up, because the movement not at every time, but there have been so many instances when the labor movement, whether it's a certain federation or a certain union or just a certain area, has been presented with this choice of like, okay, we could see this group of new workers as people that are trying to take our jobs, people need to push out and discriminate against, or we could see them and think, oh, here's some new people we could bring into our movement to make everyone stronger. And not everyone has made the correct choice throughout the centuries, right? And yeah, it's interesting thinking about this like white working class conservative dude thing too, because that's where I'm from. My family is like that. They're all union, like steel workers, construction workers, operating engineers, and they're also like very conservative. Like they kind of range from like Reagan to Trump to listen to Alex Jones and Barry Gold in the backyard. Like they run the gamut. But they're also lifelong union men. And there's like an interesting tension there too, because it's like, okay, so you're part of this collective movement, but you are not acting in solidarity with anybody but yourself. And I guess it just goes to show that this movement is not just uniformly anything. It's not, the labor movement, it as an entity that exists, has made progress, but it's not an implicitly progressive movement. It's been up to the workers and the people involved to push it in the directions that they want it to go. And I think, thankfully, there have been so many progressive and radical and visionary people throughout the centuries that have seen, the dangers of division and giving into racist and xenophobic rhetoric, and just how harmful it is to exclude instead of include. And I think it's because of them that we've found any kind of progress and we've gotten any further and any closer to where we need to be. But yeah, I mean, there's still cop unions, there's border guard unions, there's conservative union members all over the place. It's I think it just comes down to the fact that the labor movement is made up of people, and people are complicated.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much, Kim.
I hope so. I think about this stuff a lot.
We've got a couple of great questions coming into the chat now. So you can probably see these too. We have a great one from Helen about what you think of George and Jean promoting your book. I'm glad to see they inspired her to get it.
Oh my God. Isn't that, I would have never thought that the biggest labor influencer of 2022, I never would have thought we would have had a labor influencer in 2022, first of all. But the fact that it's a couple little kitty cats on Twitter, it's very surreal. I did send whatever human works with them a copy of the book, which is how they got it. And it's just, I think it's really cool. I think it just speaks to this kind of this shift in public perception we're seeing around unions, where I think even like 5 years ago, especially before media, like digital media organized and so many more people in the media kind of had firsthand experience with organizing, I think there's kind of this idea among people that weren't intimately involved that unions were something kind of like this old fusty thing from the past, like, oh, it's just something for construction dudes, it's something for coal miners, it's nothing to do with me and my life. And I think that's really shifted a lot, especially in the past couple of years, even the past couple of months. And the fact that you can't even like union busters get dragged to hell on Twitter now, like they're like savvy internet use, like trolling Amazon's union busting job applications. Like unions are a lot cooler than they've been in my lifetime. And if it takes a little orange kitty cat to help keep that momentum going, then shout out to them and whoever helps them type, because I mean, I love seeing like photos of cats and dogs and pets with my book. That's my favorite thing. So they definitely influence that too. So shout out to Jorts and Jean and whoever it is that is helping them do what they do.
And this, I mean, I will also say, I think of Kim Kelly's columns in Teen Vogue as being part of how this generation of folks learned about this. So
I'm trying.
I send it right back to Kim on that. Also, we've got a question. It's not specific, but I appreciate this sort of what comes next for these ongoing struggles. As someone who's sort of studied struggles beginning to end historically and contemporarily.
Oh man. Oh yeah. I see someone saying, oh, Amazon, Starbucks. Those are so interesting. Who would have seen that happening? And like, I'm always optimistic, you have to be, but I am very curious to see about what will happen once they finally get to the bargaining table, if they get there at all, because we know that Amazon and Starbucks do not value their workers and certainly don't want to sit down and talk to them as equals. And we know they're going to pull every legal trick they can in the book to avoid doing that. I mean, they can't run forever. And I'm hoping we get to a point where we do hear about negotiations and we do see more action happening around that, and see like, leaders like Christian Smalls and Derek Palmer and all the Starbucks workers like kind of advancing to that the next circle of union membership, right? Like, okay, you won your union, you got on that first step. Now you got to do all the really hard stuff that's way less fun than having barbecues. Like I remember when we organized Advice, it felt like so cool and sneaky to have our little meetings and like do our little emails and like be organizing. And then we went public. We're like, cool, we're a union. And then it was like, okay, you're going to spend the next 2 years in meetings 5 times a week forever. Like, oh no, that part is less glamorous. But I mean, that's how you get, like, that's how you win. And I think I'm really interested to see what happens with those folks. I think that they have built up so much support, so much public goodwill, and such a good camaraderie with the rest of the established labor movement. I mean, shout out to Boston. We've got Sean O'Brien, the new head of the Teamsters, out here taking photos with Chris Smalls. Like, I think that if the traditional labor movement plays it right and understands that they need to be following the leads set by these workers and not swooping in and be like, okay, now let the grown-ups take care of it. That's how you lose. These workers know what they're doing, but they need support, they need infrastructure, they need resources. If everyone plays this right, I think this could be pretty big. And I don't want to harp too much on the NLRB stuff because that's real nerdy, but if we can get rid of captive audience meetings, if we can get Joy Silk back, like if there's all this like kind of nerdy legal stuff that could happen that could make it a lot easier for workers to organize, like this could be the catalyst for something big. And I hope it is, because without hope you don't got nothing, and we definitely deserve to have some hope at this point.
And speaking of hope, we've got a great shout. This is local to the Connolly Branch from Adrian here in the chat. Unionizing workers at a small grocery store in JP. This is the City Feed Union. So you may not have heard about this one. It's local, but this is part of, and I want to cite, a really wonderful movement of independent coffee shops. Again, these kinds of businesses in Boston that aren't always seen as organizable or weren't, but now are. So Pavement,
That's
Darwin.
Right. Alex Press wrote about that, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. I just saw some stuff about that. We have, there's a little movement like that in Philly too, with Good Karma Coffee and some bagel shops, like down at Korshak Bagels is organizing. And it seems like, and I'd be interested to hear from workers involved just about how this Starbucks drive has kind of impacted that organizing, because hopefully it's been inspiring and hopefully it helps, like the massive amount of media attention on those struggles will help elevate the stories of other independent shops who are part of this same movement, part of the same wave. They don't have the Starbucks brand name, but I mean, it's all the same. Oh, here's the City Feed Twitter. I gotta follow that stuff. And also I just love seeing smaller places unionized too, because we hear about, like John Deere and Kellogg's and Kroger and Starbucks, like massive corporations. But I think the bagel shop down my street, there's like 7 employees there and they unionize. And that's totally cool too. Like that's just as valid, just as important to celebrate. Like you don't have to change the world, but if you can change your workplace, and that's the same thing. That's just as good.
I want to give one more shout out too, because I think here in Boston, we've got an example where we have the folks organizing in those independent coffee shops have been with Unite here and the New England Joint Board, but we also have active winning Starbucks Workers United branches.
Yeah.
And to see the solidarity and no rating, thank you to those unions and those workers for working together, even if it's across different unions in the movement, for understanding that this is bigger than raiding one another's shops or getting into those fights. So that's what's been really, I
the
appreciate
rating
so
thing. There's been some interesting developments there that we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens there. I think it is a very good time to play nice with one another if we're going to try and be part of this big wave and win. And if there's anybody involved in any unions that are thinking about raiding, please don't do that. Please see what the workers want and maybe follow what's maybe read the room. Read the room.
So we've got two great questions here. And so the first one, the one that came in for me is from Robert about how to reach consumers of Amazon and Starbucks about the abuses workers are undergoing, have undergone, continue to undergo in those places.
I mean, that's the journalist's job, right? To get in touch with people and find out what's going on. I think, there's been really great reporting. I want to shout out Lauren Gurley and Luis Feliz Leon, I always mess with his middle name, who have been following the stuff at Amazon and Staten Island really closely, folks in New York, but even people that have been on this kind of tech and labor mix beat that's emerged. Like there's a reason that people know about Amazon drivers having to pee in bottles. It's because reporters got it out there. And it's always kind of tricky figuring out how to get sources, how to get to know people in that actually work there. But once you show that you're trustworthy and that you're interested in telling their story and that you want to protect them, that's how you get all the good stuff. Like one of the last times I was in around Christmas, last time I was in Alabama, it was to interview a couple workers, including Isaiah, who about at the Bessemer Amazon warehouse about the day that 2 workers died and the company tried to cover it up. And this is someone died on the shop floor and then someone went into cardiac arrest, had to leave work and then died at the hospital later. You're not going to hear about that if the company, if you just pay attention to what the company has to say. You have to talk to the people who are living it. And that's something that I know a lot of really great reporters try to do, and I try to do, is to center the voices of the workers and try and it's kind of like what I try to do in my book, just try to humanize people and show these are flesh and blood people dealing with this stuff. It's not just some person in a uniform like you see it in a commercial or whatever. This is someone with a mortgage or rent or medical issues or a parent they need to care for. Even just being in Alabama and hearing folks tell me about the injuries they sustained, about what it does to your wrists and your knees, and seeing people in compression garments. Sometimes it takes that very personal, I guess, just that personal connection to realize oh man, this is something's got to give. We have to do something about this. And that's the reporter's job, to bring those stories out there and center them. And yeah, you always have to reach out to the company for some bullshit comment, but don't believe them. They have a vested interest in keeping all the bad stuff under wraps. So it just goes into the old, my personal adage of don't trust anybody who's rich.
Well, and I wanted to add to that too. We had a Boston Labor Conference back in March. Our UMASS Labor Resource Center puts that together every year. And I wanted to shout out MassCosh, who do amazing work on this, Coalition for Occupational Safety and Health. And also just the degree to which I think in your book, and particularly in the chapter on disabled workers, you make this point that, right, this is an issue that every worker needs to think about, because occupational hazards are a reality of unfettered capitalism. Whether it's miners getting black lung, whether it's the Amazon workers you were just talking about, right? This is not something that's niche. This is not some side movement. This is central to understanding what happens on the job when there's no check and there's no organizing.
It's how there's this saying within the disability rights movement, this disability justice space specifically, there's no such thing as abled and disabled. Everyone, there's disabled and there's temporarily abled. We're all eventually gonna fall apart or have something happen. And whether that happens at work or in a different context, it kind of depends on the luck of the draw. But so many people are enter a disabled state because of the lack of workplace protections, because of the way their workplace is set up, and how people in charge don't necessarily care about them as humans. They see them as profit makers. My granddad died 2 months before I signed the contract for this book from mesothelioma. which an old coal miner in West Virginia told me they call white lung. It's because he worked in a steel mill for 40 years full of asbestos, and it followed him home. And he was disabled at the end of his life because of his working conditions, because the people that ran the steel mill didn't care about what the workers were breathing in. And there's a lot of stories like that. And I don't want anybody else to lose their grandpa because of things like that. And anything we can do as workers, as people in the labor movement, that's just conscientious human beings to try and limit the amount of pain and suffering and injury that happens on the job. Like, that should be a priority, right? Like, we don't need anybody to lose their life in an industrial accident if it can be helped. We don't need someone to die in a shipping container in an Amazon facility in Bessemer, Alabama. Like, there are a lot of people that have been lost or whose lives have been irrevocably changed that should never have happened. And yeah, I'm getting a little getting emotional now. But yeah, we have a lot of responsibility to one another. And if we do have the power or are able to build power to force the kind of change that will protect more of us, we got to do it.
Thank you for that. And I will say my own mother's had MS since I was 5 years old, and she has always referred to me as temporarily able.
Yeah, it's a very temporal state. Like, I showed up like this, but I'm sure I'm going to have more things to deal with later on.
And in that vein, I want to acknowledge Katie Meyer, who also came and presented at that Boston Labor Conference on her fantastic research at BU, where she's also a grad student organizer, I believe, looking at the students with disabilities in schools and the way different unions were responding to that during the pandemic. But Katie has a great question here about the importance of teaching disability history and labor history in schools for our students with disabilities. So you can read it too, but she's asking how educators might use this book so students can see themselves in the labor movement.
Ooh, I love that. Yeah, I mean, hopefully this is something that's not, it's like in the works or whatever, but we are going to be making a young readers edition that'll hopefully help out for like middle school, middle school, high school age readers. But hopefully the book itself is accessible enough that maybe a precocious teenager can figure it out. But I mean, I think focusing on the intersections and kind of the exciting stuff might pull people in. Like, an example that I always mention when it comes up, because I think it's just so cool, is the Section 504 protests. And I think it was like the 70s when a group of disabled activists occupied a bunch of federal buildings across the country. Like, that is the fact that more people don't know about that is wild, because that is like the toughest thing. Like, they occupied a building in San Francisco for 26 days. And they were able to do that because the Black Panthers came out and fed them, because local church community members helped out. When some of the leaders went to DC to talk to Congress, the Machinist Union showed up with a truck and some rope and was like, okay, we're going to get you there. Because this was before the ADA, before public transportation was in any way accessible. So they had to figure it out. I think maybe and I wouldn't say to focus on the juicy stuff maybe, but if you're talking to kids, focus on the juicy stuff, being like, yeah, disability history includes big protests and the Black Panthers and all of this cool stuff that you might know a little bit about. And this applies directly to you. Like, your life is the way it is because of what these people did, whether it's the Capitol crawl or even just reading Kitty Cohn's writing about it, reading Judy Heumann's memoir. I think maybe if you start with something that's a little more pizzazz and then pull in all the other stuff. I'm not a teacher, you guys are wizards, but that's what I would do. And hopefully there's enough material in the book to kind of set you on a good path towards doing that. The kids love, I don't know, it's cool. Just think about that. A bunch of disabled people led the biggest federal occupation in US history. And why more people don't know about that is a crime. So at least tell the kids about that, because that is so tough.
This is wonderful. It's really exciting to hear there's a young readers edition in the works.
Hopefully.
That's fantastic. So there's a question that's been lingering that Emily put. I think this was asked in the opening. And I actually want to preface this, if I may, sort of moderator's prerogative, by noting that this is an issue we have at my campus. UMass Boston, I think we have 7 or 8 unions. And of course, the contracts get settled in different ways. So even though our faculty staff union, I'm a member of the Massachusetts Teachers Association myself, we have our contract. Our classified staff union does not yet have their contract. They are fighting for one now. If you're connected, support that fight. And so for that matter, are our graduate students fighting for their contract. And this is a challenge that presents itself on our campus because we have 7 unions across a group of workers who try to work in concert, but of course the demands of our labor law system break this apart. And I will say we haven't always got it right. I think we're getting closer, but this is a great question. What's the advice for a workplace with 3 different unions, with multiple unions, in our kind of fragmented universe of American labor law?
Wow, that is a tough one. So I mean, and I'm gonna sound so like, I always default to like slogans because I used to speak at union meetings all the time. We gotta work together. But I mean, it does come down to finding that common ground and finding solidarity where you can. Because even if you have a bunch of different professions and a bunch of different job titles, there's probably a lot of similar things you're pissed off about or similar conditions you're trying to change. Like even if you leave out all of the thorny legal stuff, labor law stuff, like all the boring red tape stuff, and just talk to the people, maybe whether it's by like putting together a joint committee with people from every union and talking about ways you can work together and talk about ways that you can kind of address common issues and concerns. It sounds so simple, but I feel like talking to people is the best way to get anything done, and showing and listening too. Like, even if you think that you have nothing in common with a person and you end up in a room with them and you're trying to talk about labor stuff, like, oh, this person has no idea what I go through. Like they don't know what I do. They don't know what I struggle with. Well, then tell them and listen to what they tell you. And maybe you can find some common ground, whether it's like you hate the same administrator or you take the same bus or you can eat lunch at the same place. Like, I feel like there's always a way to find some common ground and to build off of that, because it's always easier for the people in charge to split us apart and to convince us that we don't have anything in common, because that makes us weaker and easier to break. But if you're able to find those commonalities and build real community with one another, that's how you get stronger. Hopefully that is useful. I mean, it's not like not reinventing the wheel by saying talk to people, but sometimes it gets left out, especially when you're separated into all these different units and have meetings at different times in different places. There's a lot to be said for getting people in a room and being like, okay, what are we mad about? What are we gonna do about it?
And I will shout out our Mass Teachers Association. Again, I know this person may not have been asking about my campus or our unions, but one thing we've done, open bargaining, which has brought our members into bargaining and allowed us to see just how disdainfully our administration treats us when we're at the bargaining table. It's very different than the public messaging or the emails you get from the provost and the chancellor. Open bargaining has done a lot to open eyes, and open eyes build solidarity in a big way for us, I think. So that's been...
knowing how the boss talks about you is a very animating factor, I think. Like, look what I did for Chris Smalls. That was the biggest mistake they ever made, trying to cut that man down.
I want to acknowledge there's a great comment here noting that there are a really wide range, not just blue collar, but white collar women, dominated and processionals or discarded, job descriptions that are physical. Watch out when you hit your 50s. And repetitive movements and limited mobility can easily get someone let go. This is really important. Any kind of workplace, not just the ones we think of as dangerous, can be places where people, through repetitive motion, through any number of ways, are sort of finding themselves suffering.
Oh yeah, I mean, ageism is a huge problem in the workforce and the labor movement too. Like, there's so many different ways that a worker can be discriminated against, and they're all bullshit, and they're all important. Like, we need to be organizing around all of that. I mean, my wrists get sore all the time just from typing and doing my little typing on my laptop. I can't imagine what clerical workers and people have to do heavy duty filing and things like that deal with. Like, there's just so many different ways that your body can break down because of the work you're doing. And I think that's a good point. Like, it's not like the book says, like the commenter said, it's not just blue collar workers that have to worry about getting hurt on the job. And it's not always just getting hurt either. Like, workers in any profession, in any situation, also have to deal with things like racism and misogyny and transphobia, homophobia, sexual harassment. Like there's a lot of ways that someone can be harmed at work, and we need to be fighting against all of them because they're all important. They impact predominantly the most marginalized, most vulnerable workers.
I'm waiting to see if other folks have questions. I'm sure they will, but this is well, and this too, I think, is something that the book really does bring out, that there are these multiple axes of oppression and exclusion that workers face, and that when you organize, you can start to not just address each of those, but you can start to sort of transform the way you think about all of those.
Yeah, it's like there's this example that I bring up a lot because I think it's cool. For most of this book is stuff that I just thought was cool. For example, in 1946, the Great Sugar Strike in Hawaii, it was a situation in which the majority of the plantations, no, if not all of the sugarcane plantation on the islands were owned by white European dudes who lived in the mainland and employed kind of a rotating cast of different worker groups. Like at first it was Native Hawaiians, and then Chinese and Japanese and Korean and Filipino and Puerto Rican, like workers from all over. And they explicitly kept them separated. They paid different workers differently. They had different camps where different ethnicities were kept, like Filipinos were here, Chinese workers were here. And I found like an explicit quote from one of those nasty old men about how they did that so that the workers wouldn't organize because they didn't want to deal with any labor unrest. And then in 1946, those workers who were part of the ILWU, International Longshore and Warehouse Union, they just said it was time to go on strike time. And the way that they were successful, the way they won was by acknowledging, okay, there's a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds here. We need to bring everyone together. And they got translators and they showed up in every meeting and made sure everyone knew what was happening and felt heard. They had strike kitchens where different types of workers took turns cooking for one another and built community that way. They saw their differences as a strength, not a weakness. And that's ultimately how they won. I mean, that's how you do it. Like keeping separate and fomenting divisions and giving in to boss propaganda, just doing his work for him. And it's honestly, all of us have so much more in common with one another than any of us have in common with Jeff Bezos. And I think that's important to bear in mind.
Well, and I will say, reading that section to me also evoked, I'm going to bring it back to some Massachusetts history, but the Bread and Roses strike. And again, under the aegis of the IWW, a similar world of, 30 languages spoken, 19 different stations, workers, certainly a woman-led strike, workers gathered to, to challenge the boss who thought they had them divided and to find out that, in fact, the whole city was on strike before they realized what had happened.
It's so cool when that happens. And like, this is not new, right? It's not a new lesson. It's so funny in a way seeing, especially more mainstream outlets that don't do as much labor stuff, seeing them talk about the Amazon labor union, like they speak different languages. They had barbecues. They reached out to one another. It's incredible what they've done. And it is incredible what they did, but they're not the first to do that. That's how we've always won. Like that's like the best tactic. They just use it in a new way. And I think that's just so important to remember. Like it's going to sound like a union meeting slogan again, but we are so much stronger together. And the only reason that someone might try to divide us is to break us off and make us easier to crush.
Well, so I have a question maybe to wrap us up, if no one else doesn't. We'll still keep an eye on the chat, of course, and on the Q&A, which was, so I'm sure there were stories that got left out. And I know you've written some of those up for The Nation, other places. Can you give us a preview? Are there stories you can't wait to get to, or you had to excise from the book because they didn't quite fit, but you're looking forward to writing about later? So what's the next labor history story you're looking toward?
Oh man, there's this woman, this journalist named Mary Heaton Boris. I wrote about it for The Nation. I lucked out so much because right after I turned in my manuscript for this thing, The Nation hit me up. We're like, oh, do you want to do like a guest column for a few weeks? And I was like, yes. Now I can expand on all these people that my mean editor made me cut out because I filed 40,000 words too many. And I got to do a little labor history series there on people like Emma Tenayuka and Silme Domingo and Glenn Fiernes and Addie Wyatt and just a bunch of other cool people that I couldn't quite figure out how to fit or could only fit in a little bit. I feel like you probably tell in places where it's like I mentioned someone really cool and then I have to keep going. Man, but Mary Heaton Boris is this labor journalist who she had like a 60-year career. She was somehow at every important labor and political event for like a 60-year span. Like she was at the Bread and Roses strike. She was in Appalachia during the mine war. She was like a war correspondent in World War I and II. And she was really progressive. She was really radical. And she was really uncompromising. She was not, she was a mother and a wife, and she was not really thrilled about either, but felt a lot of pressure to be the perfect, the perfect wife, the perfect mother, all these pressures that women feel, and it certainly felt like a century ago. And she kept working anyway. And just her writing is really great. And the way that she focused specifically on women, and she focused on getting workers' voices to the front, really like, it's really inspiring to me. That's what I try to do. Like, shout out to Mary. But there's really great biography that came out of her maybe like 20 years ago. I don't know how I could build on that, but I don't know, like I'm interested in these historical labor journalists who were also marginalized, who are dealing with wanting to uplift other workers while also trying to make ends meet and trying to survive. Like even Ida B. Wells, like she did labor journalism, like the Arkansas race riot, that pamphlet was about this horrible massacre in Arkansas that started with a union meeting. Like everything's a labor story. I feel like there's a million different ways I could go, but I'm always going to look for the stories that are a little less accessible, because I want everyone to know about our shared history, because that's going to dictate where we go in the future.
Well, that is a fantastic note to end on. I'm keeping an eye here if there are any other questions, but as a reminder, please pick up Fight Like Hell at your local independent bookstore. And thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you again to the BPL Connolly Branch for putting this on. And thank you most of all to Kim Kelly for joining us today and sharing her wisdom, her knowledge, and her passion for labor history and labor's present and future with us.
Yeah, dude, it all belongs to us. We just got to take it.
Right. So thanks again, everyone, for coming and listening in tonight. Thank you so much to Kim and to Nick, and thank you as well to Amanda from our AV team for helping to run things tonight. I hope everyone, and I know everyone enjoyed the talk, and please place a hold on a copy, buy one at your independent bookstore, and have a lovely, lovely evening.
So, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Take care.